clearly total extinction.
What are some of the actions that Muslim Views is putting into place?
Fascinating question. There will always be a role for print.
What advice do you have for our younger audience?
Your skills repertoire needs to be much wider.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the Campus Dialogues, a Muslim Views production in affiliation with MuslimFin. MuslimFin, your roadmap to Islamic banking and finance. And here this evening, we're going to have a fantastic new episode for you with our guest who's going to be introduced by my good friend and colleague, Siraj Music. Siraj?
Assalamu alaikum, Ali. How are you doing?
Alhamdulillah.
Like I always say, another week, another podcast. And today we have someone very interesting in studio with us, who happens to be the CEO of Muslim Views, Mr. Mahmood Sanglay. Mr. Mahmood, welcome to our podcast.
Assalamu alaikum to both of you, to our audience, and I'm thrilled to be here. I'm glad to hear I'm an interesting person. Never heard that before.
Mr. Mahmood, we've been hoping to have you on the show for quite some time. So we appreciate the fact that you're taking some time out to meet with us and to do this podcast. But before we get into any discussions, we've got quite a few things we'd like to unpack with you in terms of journalism, the evolution of journalism, where it started and where it's come from, and your love and your passion for it. Perhaps as a starting point, can you maybe give us some insight into your journey into journalism, where you started your career growth as well?
Okay, thanks for that, Siraj. Well, the story of journalism and my interest in journalism are two different stories. I once wrote a chapter on the history of journalism. That goes back to Adam. So Nabi Adam alayhi salam, he practiced journalism in a way that is very, very unusual and unconventional. But let me keep that aside for a moment because we can come back to it. My interest in journalism has actually, in one sense, been accidental. When I started my career as a teacher, I used to be a teacher many years ago. And in 1997, I switched from business. When I left the teaching post in 1995, I joined Muslim Views in 1997.
Okay.
So that was my formal introduction to a media company. But at school, I've always been interested in writing. Languages were my strength, and writing was a passion. So the pen and storytelling was always something I had been interested in since a young boy. So journalism then came almost naturally when it was formally introduced to me in 1997 when I joined Muslim Views.
Okay, wow. So that's very interesting. I mean, if we just look at your history, I think you have got over 24 years of experience in the journalism industry.
27 actually.
I do apologize. So in terms of, the evolution of journalism, how has journalism changed since when you started 27 years ago and what it looks like today?
Okay, so journalism is really about, at the heart and the core of it, it's about storytelling. But when you speak about journalism as a craft and as a profession, it is storytelling within certain boundaries. And the boundaries we're talking about here are professional boundaries that involve a code of ethics. There are standards, and there are processes in order for us to produce a story, that is the content, to adapt and to edit and sub-edit the story, in order to moderate it for publication purposes, and then publish and distribute. So those key processes in journalism have never changed. Okay. They've been there as a journalistic profession always. What has changed is formats and platforms and technology. So the evolution that you're referring to has to do more with the process of how the key message that you want to distribute, how the platforms have changed, how technology has changed, how technology has impacted on media companies, on the way they hire both human resources and how they deploy technical resources. So perhaps over the last few decades, the changes on journalism, on the profession, on the media industry have started accelerating. And the latest milestone that we're really talking about now is AI.
Yeah.
Previously, you could talk about social media, and before that, you talk about the internet. You know how online 2.0 and 2.1 and 2.2 have impacted on journalism and on media. And before that, it was something like email, because prior to email, we used to send messages the usual way using fax machines. If you speak to young people today, and talk to them about sending messages by fax, they ask you, what is a fax? Because they don't have an understanding of old technology.
Yeah.
So it's more a technological revolution that has driven change in journalism than anything else like social change or political change. So the social environment and the political environment are changing on their own trajectories because they evolve differently. But journalism as a craft, as a career, as a profession, is impacted mostly by technology. And that's kind of a way to encapsulate how journalism has evolved.
Absolutely. Mahmood, and how do you feel, obviously Muslim Views is a very unique newspaper within South Africa, right? The role of Muslim journalism within South Africa, what role does that play within the South African journalistic context?
Yeah, that's an important question, and there's a lot to unpack over there. So in South Africa, as you say, Muslim Views has an important role to play. Perhaps it's important for me to mention Muslim Views has a history going back, a publishing history going back to 1960, which is, when I said 27 years, I occupy a very small space in a very long journey of a publication that has, let's say, a 63, 64-year history. And if we're talking about 1960, it's important for me to mention that Muslim News, the preceding title of Muslim Views, because Muslim News published until 1986. Muslim Views was launched in 1986, a month after Muslim Views had closed its doors. And Muslim News, the one important historical fact to mention is that it was founded by a group of people that included Imam Abdullah Harun, Shaheed Imam Abdullah Harun. And he's the only newspaper person, the only editor of a newspaper who was arrested, detained, and killed in detention. When I say only, I mean in the whole of South Africa, no matter what media you're talking about, mainstream, community, whatever. So that is one distinguishing feature of our publication. Secondly, Muslim Views is the first newspaper in South Africa to appoint a woman as editor in 2003. I was in the United States for a fellowship. I went there for a Fulbright fellowship for 1 year. I was the editor at the time. And I remember in June when I left, we had put in place a young lady by the name of Akila Gaibi Daoud to be the interim or the acting editor at the time. And a week after I arrived in Washington, I got a call from Akila saying that I've just been made an offer by Oprah magazine. They're headhunting, and I think I'll be joining them. Part of my fellowship in the US was to look at media imperialism. And the irony is that another media organization from the US, where I had gone to do my fellowship, came to South Africa during the same time and poached our editor. So she left. That was the irony of it. But it was an important milestone for us also, in that we did appoint a woman editor, the first in the country at that time, followed a few months later by the Mail and Guardian, who appointed Fira Al-Hafaji. And the journey since then has been one of survival, as it's always been. And Muslim News, by the way, had a struggle in a political environment that was very repressive under apartheid. Muslim Views' struggle is somewhat different. Although it did start in 1986, still under apartheid, the struggle has evolved into one of survival in a world where media is forever changing, forever being disrupted. So the challenges of survival have to do with basically revenue and how one structures one's media company in order to become sustainable.
Absolutely. So now you're talking about, some of the challenges. So we're talking about digital media, misinformation, AI, technology. So obviously you mentioned some of the challenges that you would face as a news organization, right? What are you doing, or maybe let's first talk about the challenges, and then what are some of the actions that Muslim Views is putting into place to overcome some of these challenges?
Okay, that's a very important question as well. And I must say that if one looks at conventional journalism, or they call legacy media, most newspapers today that are still relying on remaining what we call print first are facing almost clearly total extinction. Because while print has never really been completely obliterated, and I think there will always be a role for print. I mean, if you look at a publishing house, or rather a bookshop, let's call it the actual output product of traditional and legacy media would be the traditional book or the newspaper. But let's talk about the book for a moment. Exclusive Books as a brand in South Africa has been under threat for many, many years. More recently, we've heard they're doing a turnaround. Why? Because there is still a role for print. There's still a role for publishing, for books. So the predictions that have been made by many media pioneers and business pioneers decades ago, even until recently, that print will become extinct very soon, that's been completely misplaced. There will always be a role for print. But the role of print, particularly in journalism, has been seriously disrupted. In other words, you need to readjust your position. You need to find a way and a space in that continuum of business between failure and success to place yourself in a position where you find the balance between your print product, your print platform, and the other. And the other in this instance is digital. So the digital world, the digital environment, digital media is really where the sweet spot lies between print and the other environment in order for media to become sustainable. So every media organization has a different position on that continuum. So there's no silver bullet, no complete solution or universal solution for all media companies to say, this is where we all belong, or this is the jacket that fits us all, or the shoe that fits us all. It doesn't work that way. So you've got to carve out your position, a unique position for yourself. That brings me back to the point where you mentioned Muslim Views is unique. Well, we are unique in terms of our history and our struggle and the brand and the content that we produce. I think there's a lot that has been done and that has built our identity and our brand that we can be proud of. But there's a lot that still needs to be done for us to become truly sustainable. And that's a struggle where we are now. So we're in a position, the way I kind of visualize it, it's a valley on a graph, in a sense, where there's two lines on the graph. The one graph is the graph of print, which kind of goes like this. Print is in decline because it's becoming less and less profitable. It's reached a point where that has become where that will be a plateau. But that plateau is not a sustainable line on the graph. So what do we need to do? We need to build something alongside print, alongside that straight line that is now plateaued, that creates a diversification of revenue. And that is the digital line on that graph. And that graph kind of looks like this. And where we are right now is here. Okay. So we are in the valley of two convergence points where most companies will find themselves with a challenge of either having to close shop or to look at the challenges as opportunity. And we're busy looking at it as opportunity because we see that opportunity. And maybe you want to ask a few questions about the nature of that opportunity, but just as a preface, what I can mention is that the digital opportunity here is also very diverse. None of them have the quick fix solution. None of them have a pot of gold that you can immediately extract from in order to say, look, we now are building revenue that gives us an opportunity or a trajectory that will lead to success within a given period. There isn't that kind of trajectory because no media organization actually does that. The successful media organizations that have done it globally and locally are the ones who've actually carved a unique spot on that spectrum. And that's where Muslim Views is right now. So the kind of opportunities we are looking at in digital are unique to Muslim Views. One is you take print and you look at the demand of print still in your local area. We've got a local community here, and I'm taking a kind of a microcosmic example. I'm looking at the micro level now, that we are sitting in a studio in Lansdowne at Islamia College that is part of a distribution area of Muslim views. From this very spot, which is where the Islamia Masjid is, and I'm casting my net or my angle way across the few suburbs towards the west to Surrey Estate. Between Surrey Estate, the masjid in Surrey Estate and the masjid here in Islamia, there are about 7 mosques and a few suburbs. And if you count the households, the masajid, the population, the commercial areas, you get an idea of the nature of the type of distribution and demand for the print edition of Muslim Views in that area. And that provides an opportunity to. So we're working currently on a project to distribute the content, hard copy, in order to reach an audience that still has demand for the print edition and to monetize that opportunity alongside with digital. So print and digital will always go hand in hand. That's the crude description of the project. I don't want to get into too much detail because of the time, but I think that's one of the opportunities we're looking at.
Oh, that's so interesting. Mr. Mahmood, I wanted to ask
Call
you.
me Mahmood. The last time I was called Mr. Mahmood was a teacher, Mr. Sanglay. So it makes me feel rather odd to be called Mr.
Mahmood, with regards to Muslim Views,
Yes.
as a Muslim media house, I think Muslim media, and the question I wanted to ask you was, Muslim media often walks a fine line between journalistic independence and community responsibility. How do you balance the need of objective reporting with the sensitivities of the Muslim community?
Again, a fascinating question, because media independence is fundamental to the integrity of a news organization. And when I say news organization, is everybody does media, social media, lots of things go this way and that way. And then you ask yourself, how responsible is that? So we belong to a organization called the Press Council of South Africa. In fact, Muslim Views is represented on another organization called the AIP, the Association of Independent Publishers. I want to give you a bit of background before I come to your question, because I think it's very important to describe the linkages here between how we function as a newspaper and how we protect our independence. So the Press Council of South Africa is a regulator. They regulate complaints against the media, and they've got an acronym called FAIR. So when you see the Press Council logo in Muslim Views, in our print edition, you'll see the word FAIR. And the word FAIR stands for fairness, which is what the F is, A for accuracy, I for independence, and R for responsibility. Those are the key pillars on which media regulation and responsible journalism is really, ethical journalism is really all about. So one of those pillars, the I, that's the question that you asked, addresses independence. And obviously the kind of content that you produce that reflects both locally, nationally, regionally, and internationally the content that we publish. I made this point in a workshop I was about 2 days ago. This workshop was called by a organization called the International Global Dialogue, IDG, International something, Dialogue and Global. That organization is actually reporting to UNESCO, which is an agency of the United Nations. And they organized this 2-day workshop. And in this workshop, we were basically trained on how to prepare for the impact of AI and big tech on media sustainability. And the important lesson we took from there was, no matter what changes come in media, we always must foreground our independence. So in the local community, the point that I made at the seminar for this workshop was that it's very, very easy for us as Muslim Views to criticize the United States, to criticize George Bush or Donald Trump. It's much more difficult to criticize the leaders in your local community. And that's where the responsibility part comes in. It's how you criticize. And it's not just the ethic and the guidelines of the press council. There's an Islamic ethic involved here. How do you treat your local leaders in a Muslim newspaper that is consistent with principles of the Quran, the Hadith, and basically the Sharia? Now, there's been no code of conduct developed for a Muslim news organization. And I was very intrigued when you mentioned, Ali, Muslim journalism. There is no such thing as Muslim journalism per se. There's such a thing as journalism, right? And media studies and media projects. But there are Muslims who practice journalism and Muslims who run media companies. They practice journalism and they run media companies. But they've got to do it within an ethical framework. And that ethical framework includes protecting your integrity and your independence, and also practicing responsible journalism. So to come back to your question, Siraj, is that to practice responsible journalism with your local community is to respect the people for who they are. You respect human beings, you respect our diversity, you respect our leaders, but at the same time, you practice independence by exercising your right to be critical, exercising your right to serve the public interest. There's a term in Arabic called maslaha al-mursala. In other words, the common good. So when that's an important Islamic principle. And when you practice your craft as a media person, as a journalist, you exercise the responsibility for and towards the common good. But at the same time, you do it ethically within certain guidelines. And those are Quranic principles drawn from the Quran and from the Hadith. So the balance here is look at the craft within an Islamic framework, but also within the broader framework, or rather the subsumed framework of a journalist who happens to be a Muslim but considers, let's say, the Press Code of South Africa. So alongside the Press Code of South Africa, as a Muslim journalist, we have to consider Islamic ethics. And that's a balance that's important.
Absolutely, because it's difficult to separate the Islamic Sharia and your code of conduct as a Muslim with, your journalistic kind of responsibilities, right? Because you know that you're Muslim first, right? And then you're a journalist and also running a company, right? And so that normally ends up coming through. What is interesting also in terms of, kind of coming back to the digital piece and technology and using technology, I was thinking about the age demographic of Muslim Views and its reach. Right. So can we maybe can you elaborate a bit on what Muslim Views is doing to target the tech-savvy youth, through digital media, so that they can, because we find, if I look at my nephews, for example, they not reading newspapers. Right, they're 17 years old and 18 years old, and they're definitely not reading newspapers. And if they are, they're on their phone, just scrolling and seeing, what's happening, and they may be getting small bites here and there from different social media. What is Muslim Views doing to potentially reach out to the youth of South Africa and globally?
It's all about content. And as you mentioned, the audience isn't just about what Muslim Views used to do, let's say 20 years ago, in respect of an audience aged between, let's say, 30 and 60. 30 is still considered to be a youthful audience in terms of the definition of youth in South Africa. 30-year-olds are included there. But that means if that is your demographic, you're really missing out on a far more important, maybe not far more important, but perhaps equally important demographic of, let's say, 18 to 30. And even 30 and rather 18 and below. But it's about speaking to your audience in a way that makes their lives relevant. Now, that's been an important discussion within Muslim Views for many, many years. And to get that register right, as I mentioned earlier, it is about content. Now these days, it's not just about the actual content, it's also about the distribution and the platforms. Because while we assume in the good old days, the print edition was the relevant platform for the general reader, whether it's the older person or the younger person, today the go-to platform is electronic, is digital, it is online, it is on social media, and now it's also being influenced on platforms that are susceptible to AI. So you're now talking about, as I mentioned much earlier in the introduction, a technology that impacts on the way you produce content, the kind of content you produce, and the way you distribute that content. So to speak to the youth has become more and more important. So we are working on processes that will enable us to reach that younger audience. So, for example, content relating to tech, right? That might be political. It might be completely non-political. There could be no political angle to the story that we're producing, but it's about tech. We did that many years ago when we were still print first, when there was no technology available, even online content available, that we were able to publish, before we even had a website. Back then we realized that the technology would be a aspect of our content that is necessary to reach the younger audience. It's still very much an important part of our content in our online version of Muslim Views, as well as the other content that we produce. So we haven't got it right yet. It's a journey to have an addition or the regular content that we want to produce that appeals to a younger audience. So I do think that there is again a sweet spot, the nature of the content that you might be able to produce that is generally appealing to a broad range of demographics in terms of age group. But one needs to specialize as well. So you find there are publications that focus specifically on youth, on a reader audience interest that focuses on the demographic, let's say from 18 to 30 years. We don't have the luxury of specializing for youth only, partly because we're a faith-based publication where the youth might be interested in issues, let's say, of fiqh or of culture that would be equally of interest to a much older person. So that makes it easier.
Yes.
But I think it's important also to start specializing, and that's something that I think, as the person responsible for the revenue of the company, that I need to focus on in order for us to start specializing on type of content that is kind of exclusively, the domain of the youth.
Mahmood, I want to stick to the younger audience, and the question I have is, what advice do you have for our younger audience who are looking to take up journalism as a career? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities for them in this current time?
Okay, there's two key points that need to be made here. The first one, perhaps easier to make, or more important to say, is that if you're looking at becoming a tycoon overnight, journalism and media studies is not the place to go, right? But I don't think our Muslims and our Muslim youth are shallow. They are not superficial young people who only see the material side of life and making money as the priority. And I think if you wanting to have a career in journalism, well, these days at the academic institution, they don't call it journalism any longer. They now call it media studies. Why? Because it's far more diverse than just journalism. I was reminded at the workshop I spoke about earlier, I was reminded that news and journalism is no longer the preserve of, rather media is no longer the preserve of journalism and news. Journalism and news now occupy a space in media, because media is actually run and used and consumed by people who are interested in things way beyond news and journalism. And that is to use content that has nothing to do with news and journalism to distribute. So when a young people looks for a career in media, it's not necessarily looking at to be becoming a journalist. But if you are interested in journalism, and if you are interested in media studies, These days, what you can do with media studies is a lot more than you were able to do with journalism, let's say 15, 20 years ago. If you're a media studies student these days, the opportunities are far wider because you can now go into an electronic environment that has to do with data distribution. Let's take a very real and a relevant, but a fairly unknown example. There's a company in South Africa called Centech. And if you ask young people today, what is Centech? They wouldn't know what that is. Centech is a company that actually distributes signals for radio and I think for other electronic media, including your mobile phone companies. So Centech is important for that particular purpose. If you do media studies, that is part of what you might be interested in. That could be an option or an elective or perhaps a major for you if you were to do media studies. So it's very technical, it's highly engineering focused and highly electronics focused. That's part of media studies. But if you have the skills of a writer, a good writer, if you have an eye for investigation and you feel you want to be a journalist, you can be a journalist. But you're no longer a journalist in the very narrow, conventional sense of the word. You're now a media professional. So I try not to use the word journalist in that narrow sense. That's more old-fashioned. It's still relevant because journalism still happens. We still need journalists. Journalists still produce content. They do investigations and so forth. But your skills repertoire needs to be much wider, where you have the range of skills where you can truly be called a media professional. So the advice is take up journalism, take up media studies, and become a journalist in the widest possible sense of that word.
Okay, Mahmood, appreciate it. I think just to end off maybe, if you can give us a view of where you see Muslim views in the next 10 years.
Inshallah, I hope that with the plans that we have in place currently, with the digital projects that we are running, including podcasts like this, the revival of an interest in the print edition alongside with digital opportunities that include aspects of media companies that do different and diverse things like merchandising, which is something that some companies are actually seen as a separate business. So if you take products and partnerships that you have with some of your advertisers or sponsors, you'd be in a position to produce content that is presented to your audience alongside with a product. And I don't want to disclose any details about the project that we're currently busy with, but it's actually something that is very familiar to people. It's a household product. But if you have this product that is matched with your print edition and matched with your digital content, and you incentivize the use of the print edition, you incentivize visiting our website and receiving our newsletter alongside with a household item that you can get in the mail alongside with a subscription, that's part of the incentive. So I see these kinds of interventions, merchandising and monetizing podcasts, and actually bringing in diversity of content that draws in on our local unique culture. And we have a beautiful, diverse culture just here in Cape Town, for that matter. And I'm not just speaking about Muslim culture. I'm talking about culture beyond faith, the multi-faith culture that we have, that provides an opportunity for a news organization, for a media organization to draw from that in order to produce content that appeals to people universally, like food. I mean, we're in Ramadan now, so it's an interesting point to make that when you speak about food, you speak to all human beings. And that's not just the politics of food, because that's important too. It is the culture of food, how you share. And if you're talking about food, you can actually talk about brands as well. So food brands, looking at a media content, media product that makes it really interesting with the cultural mix that we have, they say, that's really good content. I'd like our brand to be associated with it. There's an opportunity. So this is kind of diversification I'm talking about that will enable Muslim views to draw on opportunities for growth.
Mahmood Sanglay, CEO of Muslim Views. Shukran. We wish you all the success for the years ahead, inshallah. Ameen.
Ameen, inshallah.
And there you have it, guys. If you like this episode, please give us a like, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment. And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And now remember what's that